Now for a conversation on the crisis of American democracy, please welcome Ron Brownstein, Senior Editor at The Atlantic, Adam Harris, Staff Writer at The Atlantic, Elaina Plott Calabro, Staff Writer at The Atlantic, with Evan Smith, Contributing Writer at The Atlantic.
Good evening. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks to Governor Sandoval and everybody at the University of Nevada, Reno for hosting us. And of course, it's wonderful to be with my colleagues at the Atlantic. Good to see you all. Let's start at a high level for a question, with a question for all three of you. The phrase we cannot escape this campaign season is democracy is on the ballot. Democracy is on the ballot. We read it in the papers every day. We hear it on TV. It's the basis for events like this one. When we say democracy's on the ballot, Ron, what do we mean? And does everybody agree on what we mean?
No, everyone does definitely not agree on what we mean. But you know, when I think about kind of the role of democracy in this election and what we are kind of watching unfold in this country, I'm trying to remember if it was Fitzgerald or Hemingway who said that you go bankrupt little by little and then all at once. Right? So, you know, basically what we are seeing is norms that we thought were settled, right, boundaries that we thought were inviolable, being stretched, cracked, and then the all at once, January 6th, literally overrun, right? So, you know, it's not as though you know, what we've seen in democratic backsliding around the world, which is a real thing, it's happening in a lot of different countries, is not that elections are necessarily canceled, you know, or the structures and kind of fine, you know, the surfaces of democracy are erased. It's that little by little, the rules change in a way that you are not quite in the same country that you were. And I was just listening to that previous conversation, excuse me, about violence. This is one way, just think about that.
Yeah.
Over the course of our lifetime, the way in which threats of political violence have become part of the background noise of our civic life, it's a different place than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, we've normalized it. It is in some ways the new abnormal. Elaina, what do you think of when you hear democracy's on the ballot? What comes to mind for you?
I think about the fact that this election, it's not even just about whether the candidates themselves value norms or feel that democracy is just something fundamentally to be preserved. A capital G good. It's about whether the people around them also feel that way. So I think a distinct difference between this upcoming election and 2020 is that in 2020, 2016, you still had people around Donald Trump who considered themselves guardrails of sorts, who noted his anti-democratic impulses and felt that they were almost being altruistic and associating themselves with him, being on his campaign.
Yeah, they were the adults in the room.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
You do not, I cannot stress enough that you do not have that around him anymore. So when we think about not just Donald Trump's authoritarian impulses, anti-democratic impulses, it's not just him, it's the cabinet that he is likely to put together. It's chief of staff, the people around him day in and day out as he's making decisions. There's not right now a Jim Mattis, for example, who is likely to say, I will put my head down because I feel this is my duty. I could possibly be proven wrong, of course, but that is not a prevalent impulse within the Republican Party right now.
Adam, let me come at this a little bit differently. This question of democracy being on the ballot is not a literal question, it's an existential question. Literally, no matter what the outcome of the election is, on the day after Election Day, this will still be a democracy, right? So in that sense, it's not literally on the ballot, but it's all the things that both Ron and Elaina talked about, and even the rollback of rights that we had taken for granted for decades.
Yes, yeah, and I will kind of trouble that a little bit and say, you know, we've heard former President Trump in speeches say things like, well, I'm going to rule with a, you know, kind of an iron fist on day one, right? I'm going to, you know, be that strongman leader on day one.
Yeah.
And so I think our understanding, I have the distinct pleasure of following two fantastic answers, but like our understanding of those like fundamental norms, right? The things that we all held so dear about democracy. We don't agree. People don't agree on those fundamental principles of democracy, and that is what I think.
So once upon a time, we might have started with a foundation, all of us in this country, with a foundation of things we agreed on, norms that we agreed to, and then we diverged. And today, we don't even have that sort of those table stakes that we once upon a time had. I want to spend most of our time talking about issues related to this question of democracy and the moment we're in. And Adam, I want to start with you. I want to start with college campuses, since that's where all eyes seem to be trained right now. The story of the moment is, of course, protests here, there, and everywhere, which started out about Israel and Gaza specifically, but have kind of morphed into also being about free speech and free assembly, and a law enforcement response that has candidly made for pretty gruesome visuals over the last couple of days. How does all of this activity on college campuses right now, feed into the election cycle and feed into this question of the state of our democracy?
Yeah, I think so. So first, it's fascinating that we have arrived at this moment, because it feels that people are misunderstanding or misremembering what college campuses have historically been like, right?
Right.
If you think about them as hotbeds for protest, as hotbeds for activity, one of the first stories, literally the first story that I wrote for The Atlantic, was about a building occupation at Howard University. The police weren't called in. It was the president, effectively negotiated with the protesters. They weren't, threatening suspensions. They weren't threatening expulsions. They weren't calling the police in. When you call the police in, it sort of necessarily escalates the situation. And at Columbia, the police were called in, weeks into the encampments and the protests. But at the University of Texas, they were called in immediately.
I mean, right away.
There's the old saying that you should not comply in advance. And effectively, what it seemed was that the governor of Texas was going to say, we probably need to bring the police out. And a couple of weeks ago, the president of the University of Texas had a quote on a call with faculty where he said, we need to operate in a way that shows that we are being good stewards of our institutions. And you didn't necessarily have that pre-compliance with outside political pressure before. And I think that the more that happens on college campuses, which are supposed to be places where you have exchanges of ideals,
right.
It sort of tears at some of that fabric of those basic democratic principles.
Does the politicizing of the higher ed space, Ron, remind you of anything? You are the elder statesman on this stage. Yeah. I mean, you're old, right?
Well, not old enough to remember it personally, but yeah, sure. I mean, in many ways, the situation now looks a lot like 1968, where, you have the Democratic Party that is divided over a foreign conflict. I mean, it's obviously there are not nearly as many people who are as emotionally invested in the Gaza war as in Vietnam, when actual, sons at that point were being sent. So it's not at the same intensity, but there are parallels. And obviously, as we were saying, like, once you get beyond whatever issue you're protesting to the question of free speech and the ability to protest and an overreaction in kind of coming in and violently clearing space, it kind of feeds on itself. And guess what? The Democratic Convention is in Chicago.
Yeah, I was about to say, you couldn't have a better bookend to 1968 than the fact that in a couple of months we're going to be back in Chicago.
And someone is going to be chanting, "The whole world is watching," in all likelihood. But the other part of it that's real, where this gets really complex, is I think about the people who are protesting, if and they may feel morally impelled in some way to act, to either not vote or vote for a third party or vote for Trump in a way that punishes Biden for what they view as a fundamental moral failure in allowing Netanyahu to go as far as he has without effective pushback. I mean, the risk they face is that the outcome of that would push policy even further in that direction, not only there, but here. I mean, I point out all the time that, Stephen Miller, who is Trump's top kind of immigration advisor, regularly posts pictures of rallies that are, pro-Palestinian rallies, and writes, the caption in the social media is, ICE will be busy in 2025. And what he means is deporting people.
Right.
So
this is the loud part out loud, not even the quiet part out loud.
So the parallel, of course, is that the people who withheld their vote from Humphrey in 1968 did not think they were voting to enable the bombing of Cambodia in 1970, and the invasion of Cambodia. That was not what they had in mind, but it is what they got. And so it becomes a situation of just incredible complexity for people to have to work their way through, but they should have a clear sense that they may want to make a moral statement. It will also have a practical consequence.
Right, and an election is a choice and not a referendum, right? This is not Biden versus anti-Biden. It's Biden versus somebody else in the end, or somebody's else. Elaina, Ron alluded to Democrats at war with one another. I want to ask you about Republicans at war with one another. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the U.S. House, was on the Columbia University campus just the other day. Congress has entered the chat, right, on this subject. You just wrote about Speaker Johnson, an extraordinary profile in the Atlantic. I encourage everybody to check it out. Talk about the mood in the Capitol right now as you see it, and how the divisions there, not so much D versus R, but R versus R, play into the fall campaign.
It's funny, having covered Republicans on the Hill for several years now, I think the past 2 years I've gotten to the point where you speak with Republicans and the Democratic Party might as well not exist. Hakeem Jeffries, I think at times is just like, are we window dressing? Because last time I checked, we were the opposition party, but you guys are very preoccupied with your own stuff right now. But to me, Mike Johnson fits in so well, I think, with the general theme of this conversation, which is that I think we've reached a moment really in the extremes of both parties where democracy and ideals of process and just basic civility have come to feel precious. That, the stakes are too high right now. The moral questions are too just pertinent for and urgent for something like process to feel important at all. Mike Johnson was somebody who came into office and did not feel that way, felt that, politically, ideologically, this is somebody who is incredibly conservative. This is somebody whose voting record really mirrored the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the conference in many ways, which is why when he was elected, Matt Gaetz was really triumphant. He said, this is our first sort of MAGA speaker that we've ever had. They were immediately outraged, though, by the simple fact that Mike Johnson valued keeping the government open. It's the sort of thing that in the past, it wouldn't be a question that no matter sort of what your conservative or liberal ideals were as a Speaker of the House, wanting to keep the government open was not an especially controversial desire to have. But it is now, because it's never just a practical choice anymore between, do I play the long game to get the policy outcome I want in the end, or do I throw it all on the table right now? That's what people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Freedom Caucus feel that Mike Johnson has essentially turned to the dark side. Marjorie Taylor Greene on the Hill the other day had a blown up image of Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries embracing, saying he's now the Speaker of the Uniparty. And again, this all goes back to just wanting to keep the government open. So again, the idea of just basic process to a lot of partisans today, not just voters but politicians, has just become too cute by half to want to deal with.
So what is the practical effect on this election? I mean, we obviously have two different elections happening on the same parallel track, or on parallel tracks, pardon me, Elaina. One is the presidential race, but the other is a battle for control of both houses of Congress. We right now have a Democratic majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House. The conventional wisdom is that we may have a split Congress next time, but it would be the inverse of what we have now. What is your sense of how the politics around the Speaker and the divide within his own party feed into this question of who will have control of the majority next time?
Well, we'll see how a lot of it plays out in primaries right now. I mean, what Mike Johnson, I was just at the House Republican Policy Retreat at the Greenbrier, and Mike Johnson spent an hour in a closed-door session. I spoke with members about it afterward, saying, I mean, it was almost as though he were talking to a kindergarten class. I mean, the top line thing he was saying, if you guys have issues with each other, I encourage you to deal with them one-on-one, have conversations. His exact quote I heard was, "A kind word lowers the temperature. Don't go straight to social media," which then led into, I wish you guys wouldn't spend so much time primarying each other. At which point, and this is all real, this didn't make my story, so I'm glad I get to talk about it now. But Bob Good, a Virginia congressman who's chairman of the Freedom Caucus, has spent a lot of time trying to get Dan Newhouse out of office. This is a Washington state Republican who voted to impeach Trump. So during this conversation at the Greenbrier, Dan Newhouse says, you know, there are people in this very room right now trying to get me out of office in my primary. Why are we doing this? And Bob Good stands up. He knows he's being called out. He stands up and he says, well, I'm only doing it because you're doing it to me. You guys are doing it to me. And it is true that there are some moderate Republicans on Capitol Hill who are trying to get Bob Good out of office. Dan Newhouse is not one of them. So Dan Newhouse then says, I'm not. And he's like, well, you're aligned with them spiritually, essentially. So I'm not going to stop trying to get you out of office, which to me just crystallized the utter incoherence of a lot of national politics right now.
Right. Ron, let me come back to you and ask you to talk about the presidential race. Frame the Trump versus Biden contest for us. And, you know, I'm thinking here that today we get our news as often as not from comedians. I remember a few months ago Seth Meyers reducing the presidential race, in his words, to 81 versus 91. 81 being the president's age, 91 being the number of felony counts that the former president was facing. And he said basically how this race ultimately resolves itself is going to be whether people choose 81 versus 91. Is that a fair way to be as reductive as possible in thinking about this race?
Yeah, it's a great line at what is he, 12:30?
Right. Late.
But it's probably a little too cute, but it's a good line. I'll have to remember that. So you know, the two big things that we have to keep in mind is that we are closely divided as a country and we're deeply divided as a country. And when you put the two together, you get a very volatile compound every 4 years, every 2 years, really. So closely divided means that we are in, to your question just now, like we're in the longest period in American history where neither party has been able to establish a lasting advantage over the other. It's hard to kind of comprehend that because we're living in it, but only for 16 of the last 56 years has one party, the other had unified control of the White House, the House, and the Senate. 58 of the previous 72 years, one party did. So we're really closely divided. Power goes back and forth regularly now. Neither party has controlled the Senate for more than 8 consecutive years since 1980. That's never happened before in American history. Never gone 40 years where neither party has had the Senate for more than 8 years. A lot of other different measures. Closely divided, deeply divided. We're really dug in and we're really separated. Okay, like, you know, we have a geographic, demographic, and generational sorting out and separation of the two coalitions that are in many ways utterly antithetical at this point in who they are and what they want for the country, but are almost exactly equal in size, right? So that's kind of the baseline is there are not a lot of moving parts. Like, that's how it starts. There's not a lot of moving parts. And in many ways, the issue, I think, is not so much the number of voters who are choosing between Trump and Biden as voters who are choosing between each of them and not voting. Like, you know, I mean, it may be like more vertical than the horizontal. There are only 7 states that are like plausibly in play.
Right.
Right? One of them is this one. So what all of this adds up to is that you only get changes at the margin. But because we're so closely divided, the changes at the margin matter. And I think you know, this is the election that no one wanted, everyone expected, but the way it's unfolding so far is not what we expected, which is Biden is holding his vote from 2020 quite well among white voters. And the reason why Trump's in a better position, both nationally and in states, is because he's running better than he did last time among brown and black voters. And similarly, Biden is holding his vote better among seniors than he is among young people. Like, neither one of those are things you would have said
Right.
2 years ago. So the question becomes, are these things sustainable? Can Donald Trump, talking the way he does about all sorts of racially related issues, run better than any Republican since the civil rights era among Latino and black voters, all the way to the finish line, right? Can Joe Biden hold his 2020 vote among blue-collar white voters when they're getting pounded by inflation? So the changes aren't going to be big, but these counterintuitive changes at the margin really are what the race is at this point, and who can kind of undo them and maybe expand their own electorate a little bit is probably going to be.
And literally, as the cliche goes, every vote counts. Right? In one of the 7 states that will decide the outcome of the election, people in this room choosing to vote or not to vote could ultimately hold the fate of this election in their hands.
We're talking 330 million people, and it'll probably be something like 50,000 people in 3 states that decide which direction we go.
This is not just about the presidential election. Republicans have a 1-seat majority
at the moment,
in the House
right
now.
Right, yeah.
So talking about marginal changes, I mean, the House of Representatives is just anyone's game right now.
That's exactly right. Adam, I appreciate that Ron called out the racially charged language, policies related to race. It's not just rhetoric, it's actual policy that the former president has turned to as part of his campaign, because I want to come back to college campuses. You know, before we were talking about the protests over Israel and Gaza, and the conversation was around free speech and free assembly, we were talking about, you know, I'm old enough to remember 3 weeks ago, we were talking about the elimination of DEI offices, race as a through line on admissions and on hiring on these very same college campuses. And in places like Texas, where you grew up and where I live, this is a real thing that has caused enormous controversy up through and including today, where there's still discussion of what the impact of this is going to be on the public universities and on the public dialogue. Talk about race as a through line in this campaign.
Yeah. So as it relates to college campuses, right? You know, thinking about the DEI rollbacks, where we have gone from that. I'm going to mention Texas for just a moment, because promise me, stick with me for just a second. So 1980s, University of Texas, they have their divestment protests. Out of that grows among black students on campus, they represented a very small percentage on campus, even though it was something like 14, 15% of the state, maybe a little bit larger than Hispanic students represented something like 10% of students on campus, but they represented something like 22% of the people in the state. And so they were like, our representation is incredibly low, as our graduation rates are incredibly low. It was something like 30 and 40% for black students and Hispanic students, respectively. You move into they spoke with the president. They were able to create this minority information center, right? A place that folks could go on campus to basically learn about how to navigate a campus that had only 20, 30 years before desegregated. You fast forward to now, that Minority Information Center becomes the Minority Enhancement Center, which becomes the Multicultural Engagement Center, which was just closed in response to SB 17. Black and Hispanic graduation rates are up significantly at this point, something like 68 and 69%, which is below the threshold of about 71% that it is for everyone else. But the practical effect of eliminating programs like that on college campuses is that those enrollments, those places, there's several studies that show that when you have those hubs and they go away, enrollments drop. You have basically people will leave campus if they don't feel safe there. And you will also see graduation rates drop. And so there are very practical effects of what's happening right now. As it relates to the election, in a lot of a lot of red states that are pushing for these policies, we have seen some pushback, but I also it's going to be, kind of relating to what Ron was saying about this sort of increase in black voters who might be turning out for for President Trump or may not be voting for Biden. I think some of the polls are a little bit complicated there because in some of them you'll have an overrepresentation of men, which is never the case for black voters, where more men vote than black women.
Well, the base vote of the Democratic Party for some time has been black women, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's really a critical piece of this.
Exactly. But I think that there is energy around, you do see a lot of people talking about these policies going into effect, how it has practically affected their lives or those who they know. And if Republicans were trying to pull away some of that support from Biden, this is not the way to do it.
Yeah. Elaina, so we're talking about race as a potential motivator for the vote. I want to ask you about a couple of other things. Speaking of the University of Texas, I teach at the University of Texas at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I talk to these students all the time about what's giving them reason to want to participate. And really over the last couple of months, I've heard two answers. One is abortion, and the other is the border. Now, that may be a very Texas-specific answer in the latter case. But the reality is that those two are, in a lot of ways, the ball game for the two parties in terms of what they're counting on to motivate voter turnout. Sort through those issues to the degree that you can as part of this discussion toward the election.
So I think understanding the role of abortion, you don't have to look far. You look at the 2022 midterm elections.
Yep.
I think that was a great flashpoint for understanding how when the national media in particular just relies on polling to understand what's happening on the ground instead of actually getting out and talking with voters, the story is missed. You'll recall, Evan, of course, it was a huge red wave that was predicted in 2022.
Right.
And you had those massive sort of Last Supper tables, as I call them, on network television, where they're saying it's the economy, it's the economy. Well, it wasn't. And when I was profiling Kamala Harris last year, actually, I feel like I got a rather intimate look into this because she really went out on a limb in a way that a lot of others in Washington did not, to say abortion will matter in these elections, and it will be what motivates people in how they vote. And she would have staff who would come to her, not pushing back necessarily, but saying, Madam Vice President, the polling is saying this, we just want you to be aware. But she was every week going to a different swing state. She was going to Texas, doing roundtables with independent voters who were telling her firsthand, post-Dobbs, this is what I will be casting my vote on the basis of. Yep. And she actually listened to what people were saying to her. And I think 2022, those elections were a great victory for her and really sort of reinforced this notion that what happens with abortion will actually matter for turnout. And I don't think that that's going to change in November.
So more so, Elaina, than the border. The border for a lot of people is, on the other side, a real reason to turn out for this election. What do you think about that? Ron, you want to jump in?
Yeah,
Okay, sure.
One of the big things, and people have heard this phrase, one of the big things that we've been living through for the last, really since the Clinton era, is this kind of class inversion, right? Where for most of the 20th century, Democratic Party was the party of people who work with their hands. Republicans were the party of people who wore a suit and tie to work. And that manifests itself, and Democrats ran better among voters without a college education, and Republicans ran better among voters with a college education. That began to flip in the 60s and 70s on some of the race-related issues that one of our colleagues here is writing about right now. And Republicans began to run better among blue-collar whites until you get to Reagan, 84, Reagan Democrats. They've never looked back. The core of the Trump coalition are white voters without a college degree. Yeah. Starting at the Clinton Democrats, start betting right around college-educated voters. The big thing we're seeing in the last two elections is this line increasingly mattering among non-white voters, right? That's really what's happening in this election and why you have this kind of topsy-turvy racial dynamic. The answer to your question is those two issues, if you look at it from that perspective, those two issues both push in the same direction. The abortion is an issue that is pushing more white-collar, socially moderate to socially liberal voters toward the Democratic Party. And immigration is an issue that is pushing more blue-collar, culturally conservative voters toward the Republican Party. It's like each party is fine. And in fact, by the way, there are political consultants who believe that Trump is talking so harshly about so harshly about immigration because it's the only issue that they have found works to bring back white women alienated from the Republican Party on abortion. But that's going to be, I think, kind of minimal. What you're going to see, you continue to see this divide, this kind of wedge pushing further as each party stresses issues that lean into the existing divide that we've been living with and has been accelerating.
Adam, and then Elaina, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly, thinking about that education gap that Ron is talking about, when you read these sort of attacks on higher education, you can read them as a response to the education gap. Going back, just thinking about, I was talking to John Thielen, he's a emeritus professor at the University of Kentucky who wrote like the book on the history of American higher education. And I just sort of asked him, is what we're living through in terms of the political attacks on higher education, is this actually different? Like, it feels different from, Supreme Court decisions on race-conscious admissions on down through DEI policies, on down through thinking about things like shared governance and academic freedom. And his response was effectively, if college presidents don't respond in kind, right, don't respond and really uphold those values, then we're going to see it's a critical juncture for higher education. The core texture of our institutions will be fundamentally different.
Yeah.
I was going to add about the border. I think we're way past, especially within the Republican Party and the primary electorate, this just being pertinent to Texas voters.
Or even just voters in states that are adjacent to or contiguous to the border, right? Yeah.
And I think the best way to understand that is there's a lot of polling right now where a pollster will say, how are you doing individually right now? A lot of people will say, I'm doing fine, actually. How do you think the country is? Awful. Everything is headed for collapse. And I think when I talk to Republican primary voters who do not live in a border state, I'm talking about Ohio, for example, you have to understand the way they think about the border through that lens. It's not something that is affecting their daily lives, but it does feel like an existential threat to the tapestry of America that Republican politicians across this country have really done a great job leaning into. Let's go back to Congress. Mike Johnson deciding to put Ukraine aid on the floor, throw his support behind it, and rely on a majority of Democrats to get that passed was a huge inflection point because you had Republicans who view it as a binary, help to foreign aid versus border security, that there is no sort of world in which both of those can be addressed by a political party. It is taking a stand on one versus the other.
Right. Real quick, sure. Just think about those two issues. In each case, you have partisans on each, you have Republican partisans who believe that Democratic policies on immigration are fundamentally changing the nature of America and uprooting it from what it's supposed to be. And you have many Democratic, and not only Democratic, independent voters who look at the restrictions on freedoms symbolized and capstone kind of by abortion that we were talking about before, the overall rollback of rights in red states, and say that is transforming America. And so you have this kind of sense increasing, I think, much more than when I started covering politics, that it is not only kind of a question of tweaking tax policy or even environmental policy, it is, do you feel as though the changes in the country are something that you can live with or that something that you are frightened by? Yeah. And that is the fundamental dividing line between the two party coalitions at this point. Yeah,
this is really an election in which is America still the America we know is in front of every single person.
And they have different answers.
And they have different answers. So we have about 7 minutes left. We have really good questions from the audience that have been pre-submitted. I want to bring some of those into the conversation. And I'll throw this open to all of you, and whoever wants to jump in on this, please do. Do you think political polarization has reached a point of no return? And if not, who do you think, or what do you think, I'll amend that, is going to turn things around and how? Is this idea of bipartisanship returning to the daily conversation a quaint notion? Or is it really possibly a thing anymore?
Okay, so
it's a hard one. I acknowledge
it's a hard one. Yeah. I can take the what might change it how you could reclaim some of that.
Sure.
And I'm going to go back to higher education because that's what I do. So 1790, George Washington stands up before Congress. It's his first address before Congress, and he's talking about the need to fund security, so military spending, the need to fund agricultural spending. But he tells them there is nothing that better deserves your patronage than the arts and the sciences, because knowledge in every country is the surest basis of public happiness. Because George Washington and George Washington.
Good one. You got applause for that one. That was good.
George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and James Madison had been thinking about a way to build to bring people together. And they thought that higher education was the place to do it. They had thought to build a national university. Ultimately, you end up getting places like West Point. Then you get the Morrill Act, which, gives you the land-grant institutions. And so we have this vehicle that should be a place and serve as a hub, and they thought could serve as a hub for citizenship principles. And I think, if by funding higher education in a way that sort of reflects the importance of it, I think that we could get to a better place.
Adam, I was just thinking that, George W. Bush loved to call, he loved to call presidents by numbers. He called his dad 41. He called George Washington 1. There are a lot of self-reinforcing elements to the polarization at this point, because the electorate has sorted out too, geographically. People are more likely to live around people who, not only more likely to consume media, which we all talk about, that reinforce, and more likely to live around people that reinforce their point of view. The one reason for optimism is because I think we have been given a preview of what the road we're on looks like. Anyone who are fans of Lost, remember about halfway through they switched from flashbacks to flash forwards, and January 6th was a flash forward of kind of what the road we're on looks like in on a routine basis. So I do think there is kind of a desire in parts of the political system, certainly in parts of the electorate, to pull back from that. But it may get worse because it gets better, because we are largely inhabiting separate realities at this point.
And it will require us to get worse before, you think that that's really almost the only way out of this.
Yeah.
Right, the old John McCain line, it always gets darkest before it gets really dark.
Yeah, completely black. Completely black.
Yes.
One way in which I think we've really crossed the Rubicon, especially on the right, in terms of polarization, demonization of the other side. I'm currently working on a book about George Wallace. Some critical difference, I think, between Wallace and Trump, they're often compared a lot, but what I think gets missed is that Wallace, when he would go on stage and sort of have this fiery rhetoric and would sort of say, we have to go after the other people. He was doing a speech in Cincinnati, and there were protesters outside, and he says, you've got to show them who's boss. And to his actual alarm, a lot of people in the office said, all right, well, let's go, I'm ready, and started sort of mobilizing toward the door, and he actually got terrified. He said, no, I didn't really mean that, we'll settle these things in the courts.
Right.
Once he actually saw the manifestation of his rhetoric, what it was motivating people to do, he would have a moment of sort of humanity and say, I didn't realize people were actually listening to me. Donald Trump does not have that, and I think January 6th was a great example where when he saw what was taking place, he reveled in it. It was not a moment of, we should do some damage control very quickly. So in terms of the rhetoric he's perpetuating, when he sees people actually acting on it, and a lot of Republicans in Congress are the same way now, it is not a moment where when there is a realization that people are listening and taking it seriously, that something needs to change.
So the polarization is a feature and not a bug.
I would say so.
In that worldview. Let me ask you, Ron, about the geographic rather than the ideological divide in this country. Question is, how can we engage with extensive rural communities to promote voting and political participation? I know in the state of Texas, it's rural communities, although they're smaller than they've ever been in number, that decide the outcomes of elections. But look, the fact is we have a significant geographic divide along with everything else.
Yeah, the geographic divide is kind of a reflection of the demographic divide. Who lives in big metros? Joe Biden won 91 of the 100 largest counties in America. Donald Trump, there are another 3,000. Right? Donald Trump won 2,500 of them each time. more than 2,500 each time. I sometimes say he won every county in America with a cow in it, you know? So it is real. I mean, there is real polarization. The challenge, I think, and in some ways, the effort to repeal the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, shows what is possible. Because one reason it didn't get repealed is because Republicans recognized how important the Medicaid expansion was to rural hospitals. Okay, that's a very specific example, but it goes to the point that I think public policy increasingly in such a divided society has to show that it works for people on both sides of this geographic and demographic divide. And
Right.
to the extent you can do that, maybe we can begin to lower the temperature.
Yeah. Any last words on the question of rural versus urban from you guys before we wrap? We're running out of time. No? Okay. Well, look, we're going to give you a couple seconds back. Not very many, but no time for another question. This has been a terrific conversation. Please acknowledge and thank Adam Harris, Elaina Plott Calabro, and Ron Brownstein. And I think we're going to have a visit from our colleague as we walk out, our colleague Candace Montgomery.